Welcome in, everybody, to our deep dive, into this pretty terrible event that happened close to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport.
Yeah, a mid-air collision.
Right, a mid-air collision.
Always, tragic. And in this case, the investigation's really just getting going.
Yeah, and so many lives lost. I mean, 67 lives between the passenger jet and the Army helicopter.
Yeah, it really, I think, highlights, the fragility of life and how things can go wrong, even in a, technologically advanced world like ours.
Absolutely. And as we were sort of prepping for this deep dive, what I thought was really interesting is that we're really kind of catching this investigation as it's unfolding.
Yeah, we're really in the early stages here. And that's what's so captivating about this particular incident. We have these really raw and kind of fragmented pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
We have the eyewitness accounts, we have these early reports, and we have those crucial black boxes that they were able to recover from the submerged plane.
Yeah.
So it's really like watching a detective story unfold in real time.
Yeah. I love that analogy, the detective story kind of unfolding. And I think for our listener, as we kind of take them along this journey with us, it's important to set the scene. We're talking about American Airlines Flight 5342.
Right.
A Bombardier CRJ 700 making its way from Wichita, Kansas to Reagan National.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this other aircraft, a Sikorsky H-60 Black Hawk helicopter coming from Fort Belvoir in Virginia.
Yeah, and it's important to note this wasn't just a routine helicopter flight. This Black Hawk belonged to the B Company 12th Aviation Battalion. They were actually engaged in an annual proficiency flight, specifically a night evaluation.
Okay.
And the crew was even equipped with night vision goggles, so that adds another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation.
Right, and it really highlights the level of skill and precision that's involved in these types of flights. And
Yeah.
And as these two aircraft were in this airspace around 9:00 p.m. local time, as that plane was making its final approach to the airport, this is when tragedy struck.
Yeah.
Witnesses describe a scene of just chaos and confusion.
Right. I mean, it must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. And some of the reports we've heard from witnesses are pretty chilling.
Yeah.
Ari Schulman, one of the witnesses, said that he saw the plane banking very sharply with sparks flying underneath it.
Wow.
And then we have another witness, Jimmy Mazzeo, who described a white flare in the sky.
Yeah.
And planes flying in unusual patterns.
Right. So, those eyewitness accounts are obviously very powerful and emotionally charged, but they only give us a very limited perspective.
Right.
They capture that initial shock and disorientation, but they can't give us that granular understanding of what actually led to the collision.
And that's where those black boxes come in, right?
Exactly.
Can you explain to our listener what exactly are those and why are they so important in investigations like this one?
Absolutely. So first of all, the term black box is a bit of a misnomer.
Right.
They're actually bright orange to help with the recovery effort.
Oh, that makes sense.
But more importantly, there are two separate devices, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder.
Okay.
And, you can think of the flight data recorder as like a meticulous record keeper. It captures all this technical information like altitude, airspeed, direction, engine performance, you name it. It's all there.
Wow.
It paints a very detailed picture of those final moments of the aircraft.
So like a snapshot of what was happening.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the cockpit voice recorder.
Okay.
As you can imagine, that captures all the conversations and sounds within the cockpit.
Okay.
So it provides crucial insights into the crew's actions and reactions in those critical moments.
So both of these hold really vital clues for investigators.
Right.
So what kind of questions do we hope that these recorders will answer?
So it's almost as if you can rewind the clock on those final moments by carefully analyzing that data, and the voice recordings investigators can actually piece together a very precise timeline of events. They can literally see what maneuvers both aircraft were making, their altitude, their speed, any communication between the pilots and air traffic control. It's like having a front row seat to those crucial minutes leading up to the impact.
So it's almost like these recorders are telling the story of what happened.
In a way, yes. And in this particular case, they might help us understand some early discrepancies that have already emerged.
Oh, interesting.
For example, some reports suggest that the helicopter might have been flying higher than regulations allowed.
Higher than allowed, what exactly does that mean?
Well, you see regulations stipulate a maximum altitude of 200 feet for helicopters in that specific area.
Wow.
To give you some context, that's roughly the height of a 20-story building.
Okay.
But preliminary data from Flight Radar 24, which is a flight tracking service, indicates that the Black Hawk may have been as high as 400 feet.
Wow. So double.
Yeah, double the permitted altitude.
Okay, so why would the helicopter be flying at that altitude?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Was it an intentional deviation from the rules?
Yeah.
A misjudgment on the pilot's part, or perhaps even a mechanical issue that forced the helicopter to climb.
Right.
It's a key piece of the puzzle, and hopefully those black boxes can help us understand.
Yeah, and of course, we can't talk about this incident without talking about the role of air traffic control.
Absolutely.
How do they play into this?
Well, so air traffic control recordings seem to suggest that the controller did try to alert the helicopter about the approaching plane, and it seems like the pilot acknowledged the warning.
Okay.
But the collision still happened just moments later. So this raises a lot of questions about reaction time. Was the communication clear? Was it understood? And were there any other factors that might have contributed to this tragic misjudgment?
Yeah, a lot to think about. And like we said, this investigation is very much in its early stages.
Yeah.
There's a lot we don't know.
Exactly. And, with these types of investigations, patience is key. It's a meticulous process of gathering evidence, analyzing data, piecing together the sequence of events. It's not about rushing to judgment. It's about uncovering the truth, however complex and uncomfortable that truth may be. And this is where things get even more interesting, because there have been reports of some unusual circumstances at air traffic control that day.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, the New York Times, citing an FAA report, said that the staffing level at the time of the crash was not normal. Apparently, there was only one person managing both the helicopters and the airplanes in the area, instead of the usual two.
That's a little concerning.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, if that added workload could have played a role in what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that managing multiple aircraft in such a complex airspace like Washington, D.C., it requires such intense focus and those split-second decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, even a slight lapse in attention or a delay in communication can have really serious consequences.
Right, and on top of that, we can't forget about that near-miss incident that happened just 24 hours before this crash.
Yeah. The Washington Post and CNN both mentioned that near collision between a landing jet and a helicopter at that same airport just the day before.
It's just really unsettling.
It is. And that near miss happening so close in time and location to the fatal collision, it definitely warrants a closer look. It could potentially point to some systemic issues or recurring patterns that might have contributed to both events.
But the warning sign.
Yeah, a warning sign that unfortunately wasn't heeded.
It makes you think, could this tragedy have been prevented?
Well, we can't say that for sure. At this point, the investigation is still going on, and there are many factors to consider. But it is a reminder that even in a highly controlled environment like the airspace above our nation's capital, the margin for error is incredibly small.
Yeah, and we have to acknowledge the political context here adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
It does. President Trump has been pretty vocal about this crash.
Yeah, he offered his condolences, which is completely understandable given the, just terrible loss of life.
Of course, but he also went on to criticize potential lowering of standards for air traffic controllers during previous administrations.
Right.
And even announced a temporary head for the FAA, seemingly linking the crash to these political points.
Yeah, it's always interesting how a tragic event like this can quickly become intertwined with political discourse.
It does. It highlights the multifaceted nature of these investigations. They're not just about technical details and procedural breakdowns. They also play out against this backdrop of societal and political forces.
So where do things stand with the investigation now?
Well, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, is leading the investigation.
Right, and they're hoping to release a preliminary report within 30 days.
That's right. That preliminary report will probably offer some initial findings and insights based on the evidence they've gathered so far. But it's important to remember this is just the beginning of a very long process.
But we really need to be patient and let the NTSB do their job.
Exactly. And even then, there may be some lingering questions and uncertainties. Accidents like this are rarely caused by a single factor. It's usually a very complex chain of events that all contribute to the final outcome.
Right. It's like that domino effect. One small error or oversight can trigger a whole cascade of consequences.
Precisely. And that's why these investigations are so important. They help us identify those critical points of failure and hopefully implement safeguards to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. It's about learning from the past to create a safer future.
And given the unique airspace above Washington, D.C., with its mix of civilian, military, and presidential flights, the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got everything from commercial airliners to military helicopters to Air Force One all sharing the same skies. It's a highly controlled environment. But as we've seen, even the most sophisticated systems are vulnerable to human error and unforeseen circumstances.
Which brings us back to, this investigation is far from over. There's still so much more to learn.
Exactly. And it's really important for the public to understand that, there's often this rush to judgment, this desire for quick answers. But the reality is these investigations take time.
Right.
And that's a good thing because it means that the NTSB is being thorough, examining every possible angle and really leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of the truth.
So as we wait for more information to come out, what are some key takeaways you'd want our listeners to keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge the human cost of this tragedy. 67 lives were lost, countless families, and communities are grieving. We can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details and, the search for answers. But at the end of the day, this is about people and the impact this event has had on their lives.
Exactly. And secondly, I think it's crucial to emphasize that this investigation is still in its early stages. We're dealing with preliminary information and a lot of speculation right now. And it's essential to allow the NTSB to do their work thoroughly and impartially.
Patience is key.
Absolutely. We need to resist that urge to jump to conclusions or assign blame too early, and instead let the evidence lead us to a better understanding of what really happened.
It's so easy to get, fixated on all the technical stuff.
Yeah.
The altitude, the speed, the communication logs.
Right.
But, we can't forget about the human beings.
Of course.
The pilots, the passengers, the air traffic controllers, and all their families, their loved ones.
Absolutely. I mean, behind every data point, every technical specification, there's a human story. And those human stories are what really matters.
Right. And those stories are what remind us about, what's at stake here, the real world consequences, even from like the tiniest error, the smallest oversight.
Yeah, for sure.
So, as we wait for this, NTSB investigation to wrap up, what can we learn from the human element in this crash?
Right.
What questions should we be asking ourselves?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to understand the pilot's experience and training, were they adequately prepared for the complexities of flying in such a restricted airspace, especially at night, and with night vision goggles?
Right. And were there any communication issues or misunderstandings, between the pilots and air traffic control?
Yeah.
That might have played a role?
Yeah, those are all really important questions. And we also have to think about, the mental and emotional pressures that these pilots were under.
Right. Were there any signs of fatigue or stress that could have impacted their decision-making?
Yeah, I mean, those are all valid questions to be asking. And we can't overlook the air traffic controllers.
Right.
I mean, they operate under intense pressure every single day, making split-second decisions that affect the lives of, hundreds of people. What was their workload like that night? Were there any systemic factors, like staffing levels or equipment limitations that might have contributed to what happened?
Right. I mean, it's not about pointing fingers, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about really understanding all those human factors that come into play in these really tragic situations so we can learn and prevent these things from happening again.
Absolutely. It's about looking at the big picture, recognizing that these accidents are rarely the result of just a single isolated mistake. It's usually a whole bunch of factors, human, technical, organizational, all coming together in this perfect storm of tragedy.
Yeah, a perfect storm. So as we wrap up our deep dive here into this mid-air collision, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that, these investigations take time, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It means that the authorities are being thorough. They're looking at all the evidence, considering every possible angle.
Right.
We need to resist that urge to jump to conclusions or, start pointing fingers and just let the investigation run its course.
Yeah, let them do their job.
Exactly, because only then can we really learn from what happened and hopefully work toward, a safer future in the skies. And until then, We can't forget about the victims, their families, and all those who are impacted by this awful tragedy.
Of course.
Their stories remind us of the human cost of these accidents and should inspire us to keep working towards a world where these events don't happen anymore.
Absolutely. May their memory inspire us to never stop learning, never stop improving, and never stop working to make our skies safer for everyone.
Well said. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.